We're introducing you today to Democracy and Teacher Education. It's a book written about teacher professionalism, and it's about democracy and the intersection between education and democracy. My name is Geraldine Mooney Simmie. I'm a senior lecturer here at the School of Education in the University of Limerick. My research interest is in emancipatory teaching. I'm interested in the intersection between education and democracy. My research methodologies are mostly connected with critical policy research studies, and I'm interested there in education for those who are on the margins, social injustices and inequalities. And now I'd like to introduce you to my co-author.
Thank you. My name is Silvia Edling, and I'm a professor at the University of Gävle in Sweden. And I'm also responsible for the research program at our university labeled Democracy and Equity, Learning Processes for Social Sustainability. Also co-responsible for the research group Democracy and Equity at our department. I've been passionately interested in questions concerning democracy and education since 2003, where I've done a great amount of research on the topic. So what I'm interested in, I'm looking at democracy as a broad concept that highlights questions about relations, about ethics, about social justice, and also questions about the human conditions as a central component for doing research about education. And in relation to that, I'm also interested in approaching and understanding the notion of teacher professional and the importance of actually developing seeing and perception in order to handle the complexities around us. So the purpose here is to give you an overview of the major ideas and major threats in the book which Geraldine and I have been writing. And I'm curious, Geraldine, what are the main conclusions in this book?
Yes, Silvia, I think what we're looking at here is that democracy has always been secured through the education system. So education is not neutral. It's value-laden. It's always an answer to a political question. It's always context-bound. It's always culturally connected. It always varies depending on the requirements of the moment. So it does vary in terms of the changing needs of the economy and politics of a society. So we have education then as not value neutral, and we are looking at public interest values when we're talking about democracy. That we're saying that education is not merely a private good, that we have to consider what are the public interests of society in a democracy when we're considering education. So it's really important to think that policy is not actually equal to practice. So the importance then of understanding that, and how does that make a difference to teachers' democratic assignment in teacher education. So we're looking at a policy text as policy documents, the requirements of the state, the laws, the regulations, the ethics, the responsibilities from the point of view of the policy documents. But then if we're looking at policy not equal then to practice, we're also looking at the necessity for the teachers then to step up and be professionals. And what does that involve? Because teaching is a practice in motion. It's not static, it's not fixed. It's contextually bound. So teaching as a practice in motion with its ethics. Teachers having responsibility and having the ethics. So being involved then in teacher agency, teacher autonomy. And of course, when we think then of actually democracy, we're looking at teachers as activists. And then we're looking at this part of the 21st century, what would teachers as activists look like in terms of a new activist imaginary that will bring democracy to the heart of education nowadays. So we're asking here, how should countries be ruled? And we've looked at some of the history of this. There are many, many different ways in which countries have been ruled and are ruled. There are oligarchies, there are autocracies, and of course there is democracy. And of all of the different ways in which countries are ruled, democracy is the one that pays particular attention to the space for human freedom and the space for plurality of human condition. And that particular space there for developing people who can think for themselves. And that is really, really important in this particular book in relation to teacher education and democracy, an understanding of what do we mean by democracy? And then what do we mean by that capacity for human emancipation and that capacity to think for oneself?
Yeah. And that is a good point, because one of the things which we've noticed is that a lot of people today tend to talk about democracy as if democracy is obvious. And democracy is usually seen as something good. Everyone wants to be democratic. So one of the things we want to emphasize in this book as well is that it's really, really important to pause and ponder about how democracy is understood, what kind of meaning is put to it, because it matters. Various ways of understanding democracy, let it be elite democracy, neoliberal democracy, liberal democracy, participatory democracy, and so forth. Various democratic traditions exist and come with different consequences in practice. So what we mean from an educational point of view as well is that it's really important to actually pose the questions which enables us to compare and see the differences between them. Like, how do they approach, as Geraldine was saying, the notion of plurality and diversity, for instance? Is it approached in this particular way of grasping democracy? How is the elite understood and the folk rule, the rule of the people understood? Visions of the society, the notion of the citizen, and so forth. All these questions need to be asked and asked again, because we argue that democracy isn't fixed, is something that needs to be kept alive through these questions, and democracy is important. So various ways of looking at democracy, it's also important to be aware of that they are, broadly speaking, two different traditions linked to democracy. Concepts such as thin and thick democracy, broad and narrow democracy, democracy as procedures, or democracy as a form of life, to use Jewish concept, and so forth, all try to capture a similar phenomenon in relation to democracy. So usually, or there is an idea that democracy can be understood as something narrow. That is to say, all democracy is questions about procedures, of form. That is to say, we go and vote every time it's election. We raise our hands in the classrooms. We are aware of the facts and the principles linked to it, and the acts linked to it. And it's usually in this sense, democracy is understood as a majority rule. That is to say, the majority goes to election and those people decide how to do things. However, from the beginning, democracy has always, as been said before, been linked to questions about diversity. And as soon as you add and tap ethical issues and social justice issues to democracy, that is to say, it's important to actually pay regard to various people's views, not just a single one. It becomes a bit more complicated, because then democracy demands of us to be more widened and take into consideration everyday practices and the conditions in these practices. That is to say, how is plurality coming into expression in the classrooms every day? How are we talking to people? How are the body languages? And so forth. So democracy, it's not a question about either or, so that's important to emphasize. But it's a question about, should we just focus upon democracy as narrow, or should we also broaden it? And currently it's interesting because we are facing tremendous challenges all over the world as concerns democratic issues, because what we can see is that democracy, the full democracies, where democracy is not just seen as elections, but actually takes into considerations the way a society is structured to allow a form of life, to allow an awareness, attentiveness to everyday relationships, is being threatened. And we see a decline of democracy in favor of autocratic rules. So with this as a background, it's also vital to remember then that what's happening in education and how we approach education is dependent upon how we look upon democracy as well. Or rather, how we approach education or democratic issues in education depends on how we look upon democracy. And it's a question about, should we just focus upon facts about democracy, or should we also include questions about understanding and various forms of knowledge? Should we just focus upon socializing people into a certain set of behavioral ways of being, or should we also take into consideration the sort of doing analysis, being sort of not just forming characters, but making people aware of, giving them tools to grapple with, understand the conditions they're under in order to be and also continue to be democratic citizens in the future. Understanding education is understanding educational in a relational fashion. Which means that the way we understand democracy will influence education. But it's also important to keep in mind that various ways of approaching teacher professionalism will also influence what happens in the classrooms. And similarly as democracy, there are two broad traditions when you study the notion of teacher profession and the teacher professionalism. So the one tradition focuses solely on the professional as a technician. So in this sense, it's a form of outside-in professionality. That all teachers need to do is actually to act, to tick off boxes, to follow procedures, to focus upon methodology. But the teachers are not asked to understand and grapple and see the practice around them and analyze the content which they work with, the texts which they work with, and so forth. It is all narrowed down to a question about the proper method. So from broadening up even teacher professionalism means that it's not enough to being a technician. Of course we need to be that as well. But it's also a question about providing student teachers with a capability to analyze, diagnose, if you wish to use that word, or to grasp, to see what's happening around them. Then other tools are needed. So the broader form of teacher professionalism is usually referred to as a more intellectual way of grasping educational teachers. And it's also referred to as a more inside-out professionalism, because we need to master and understand and try to understand why we do the actions we do.